I was quite pleased to have this record to go to after what we've just spoken about. Suicide Silence, Remember You Must Die. We come to, I think, the 7th album from Suicide Silence, a band who we love. I mean, Sam, historically, you and I both have been big fans of this band, both as one of the leading bands of the kind of deathcore movement who kind of represented everything cool about it, but also at points in their career, just genuine kind of crossover, big metal greats of the moment. Elliot, I would be surprised if you valued them quite so highly, but Suicide Silence?
Big fan of the first 4
Big
records.
Fan. Okay, cool.
Oh, yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, first 4 records I'm well in on. Self-Titled is an album that I admire. I like pretty much everything about it except for the actual
music.
But yeah, no, they were one of those. It was kind of surprisingly pivotal for me because it was around 2009 I started at least having some sort of understanding of extreme metal, and you hear Cannibal Corpse or Mayhem at that age and you're a bit frightened, but Unanswered as a song was at least like, oh, I at least understand what's going on, and it's 2 minutes long, I can stomach this. And then that ended up being a bit of a sort of transitional point where okay, now I can sort of branch out from here. But yeah, the first 4 records, all of them are fucking great.
Right. This is, of course, I suppose the second record in their current chapter of their career, which is what I guess you would call the post-self-titled chapter, because the self-titled album in 2017 is one of the most ruthlessly torn apart metal records of the 21st century. Myself and Sam have always been the internet's #1 defenders of that record. For me, whenever people go, oh, it was a new metal turn or whatever, it just dramatically undersells... well, there is new metal in it, but
there's like corn on there and stuff, but
how scary and unsettling the record is. If you don't think it works, I mean, Elliot, if it's not for you, fine, but at least you respect it for what it tried to do. But whether that was good or not, what we're really interested in here is how they've attempted to redirect themselves since then, because they obviously decided they weren't going to do that again, and in 2020 they released Become the Hunter, which was a much more straightforward, straight ahead Suicide Silence album, back to basics. This album, in a way, I think there's much more of interest to say than is actually present in the record, because of, I guess, the climate around it, and not just in the obvious way. The obvious thing to say is that this record, like Become the Hunter, we have a second record in a row now of just meat and potatoes, straight to your jugular, Suicide Silence. And that is what the narrative around this record is to be defined by.
Yeah, no, they had their shot at doing something different. It went horrendously wrong, so they've gone back to the basics. I think, Become the Hunter was kind of like politely received as a result, because it was kind of like, oh yeah, this is a good Suicide Silence record, but wasn't particularly feverish. But at this point, what are they going to do? They kind of been in like a no-win situation in a way, Suicide Silence, for a while, because they can't take another creative shift, because is it going to go horrendously wrong again? But other people are like, it's not because of where deathcore heavy music has moved on to, is them kind of doing this kind of Suicide Silence back to basics thing work. I've actually had a much better time with this one than I did the previous record. I think because even though this is back to basics, this feels even more old school Suicide Silence to me.
Just to quickly to go back to just about the rock in a hard place they find themselves. Like we were talking about baby metal. This record really zero fanfare. Like there was a time when, I mean, obviously particularly I remember You Can't Stop Me being the record which had obviously the had to introduce a new singer after losing Mitch Lucker, but then it felt like this massive triumphant moment. They're like, Suicide Silence were a big fucking band at that point, and this record dropped, and there is no discussion around it as far as I can see. And in a way, it's strange because Become the Hunter, Chris Garza the other day came out and criticised that record, saying they weren't really together there for kind of the songwriting for it, and he's undermined it a little bit. And he says he likes this one a lot more. The follow-up is even more one-dimensional, I think, because my favourite track on the last album was a song called Skin Tight, which was...
Yeah, that was my favourite as well.
It was the one moment on that where they went for something a little bit creepier and a little bit more skin-crawling. And that level of almost like baby step dynamism compared to the self-titled isn't really present here. Like, this record is near non-stop, front to back brutalism. I also really like that. And I think the biggest reset, weirdly, isn't just that they have kind of retreated from trying to reinvent deathcore into something else, Which I think the worst part of that to stomach, which again is something that you can criticize them with whether you liked the self-titled or not, is how much they talked a big game when the self-titled was coming out. You know, like, remember the beef that Eddie Hamida almost got into with Violet's Murder, like, because they were so keen on making out old school deathcore to be kind of like past it, and then now having retreated to that, it rings a little bit hollow. But in terms of addressing the quality of these records, the biggest reprogramming of expectations, I think, is what I mentioned about them like once being a really big mainstream crossover proposition in metal. You know, on the Black Crown and then You Can't Stop Me. That's a big band we're talking about there in the walls of metal. They were from the the deathcore world, but that's like Lamb of God sized bangers there. You know,
they cleaned up the sound a bit on those ones, and
the manner in which Suicide Silence have become like all brutal again almost seems to have jumped back past that. And I think what Suicide Silence have to be treated as now is like when Suffocation release a record or something, like one of their extreme forebears.
Yeah, I think so, because like again, I was kind of taken back by how like nasty and like scuzzy this sounds for a Suicide Silence record. That it, like obviously because they did the re-release of the debut not too long ago, and like that maybe potentially coloured their kind of like approach going into this record of kind of like we want to just get back in touch with that, and I think it is genuinely a pretty successful stab at that. And it's like I say, it's not trying to sound anything like current deathcore. It's just kind of like we just want to be a nasty underground metal band.
I think this is a bit of a tough one for me because when it's on, I like the sound of it because, I mean, my favourite Suicide Silence record is The Cleansing, and this has a huge... It shares a lot of characteristics with that record in terms of the style of riffing, the style of breakdown, and that sort of thing. The thing for me is, I do find it hard to remove myself from where they were before, and like the thing I was saying about the self-titled is, yes, people saying it's just a new metal record have got it badly wrong. I'm not a fan of that record, but I loved... Even at the time, I admired how bold it was and how daring it was and how unique it was. And I'm of the belief that we should feel free to say how we feel about records, and if we don't like them, people shouldn't be lambasted for saying so. But it feels like that whole backlash and that whole era has made Suicide Silence so gun-shy. And it's one of those things where, yes, this record is good, I enjoy listening to it when it's on, but I couldn't help but think this would have been even substantially better with a few more risks or new dynamics or some changes along the way.
Yeah, I think the really sad thing about Suicide Silence is, I mean, again, ultimately, I don't like to say these things about bands, but I think this is it for them, right? Like, yeah. I don't see how Suicide Silence are going to change their career arc at this point in terms of, like you said, Sam, dramatic shift up, I don't think are on the table. I don't think they're going to be still writing, unless they completely up just the hook level and so on to, Black Crown. But even then, I think the big problem with Suicide Silence as well is since like they pitched their big deathcore reinvention, we were still slightly before the kind of current wave of like super popular deathcore artists hitting their stride. So at the time, I don't know how many other options we had around for like new takes on deathcore. So in terms of people giving them shots and stuff like that, I don't see how Suicide Silence dramatically move from where they are now. Like I think this is the level of their career where we found themselves, and unfortunately, because of what happened with the self-titled record, I think there's always going to be that question around them that unfortunately colours the experience of listening to what are enjoyable albums, right?
Yeah.
The weird thing about this record is how, like, yes, Suicide Silence, who at one point were the great bold explorers, have fallen dramatically behind a new breed of bands in terms of spicing up deathcore. I guess the light and the victory I'm choosing to take from this is that because of that, they are also now suddenly the most old school of the deathcore bands who are like worth keeping many tabs on these days, in a way that's almost refreshing, because this record has zero new ideas. But man, does it feel like a band playing. And if you are someone who likes your death metal tinged music to have some sense of real violence and gore to it, over sounding, super processed and super triggered, this is not a record that has bowed to like a super modern sound. And when they are just ripping through these tracks, I find there is a more genuine knife edge of extremity to this record than I can tell you that a lot of the newer bands who are much more hotly tipped at the moment are getting. This record draws blood for real in a kind of unsanitized way, even though it is super regressive.
Like, my thing with this record is when I kind of heard it was like, oh, it's just more of the same as the last record. So that kind of set my expectations pretty low. And the thing is what I actually quite appreciate this record, it's not chasing trends in the slightest. It's just clearly a band doing what I think. I genuinely believe that they actually want to just, like I say, go for the jugular and sound as heavy and nasty as they can. And I think that is, in a way, I kind of quite like that about it. And it's what made me come away from this record more fondly into it than I initially expected to be.
See, listening to this, one of the things that I wasn't sure about is whether or not it does sound like that this is what they actually want to do. Because, again, putting it on, Suicide Silence have one of the most idiosyncratic, instantly recognisable sounds of any of the bands in their scene. You can tell a Suicide Silence riff when you hear it.
Yeah.
Eddie Hamida or Mitch Lucker, either vocalist, instantly recognisable. All of that stuff is, they have a style that is totally and utterly theirs. The trouble is, they made such a point when the self-title came out, and I don't want to keep harping on about it, because that was years ago, and obviously things changed, and circumstances have changed. It was all like, we're never going back. That for a couple of years later, a few years later, to be back, it's hard to shake that sort of cloud for me.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that just depends on how much stock you put in that stuff.
Yeah, I also think, there is the possibility that, bands get tired of a thing when they're playing it for a certain amount of time, and sometimes they rediscover the love for that thing by going somewhere else and then returning. Mm-hmm. And I think it would be overly cruel, I think, to deny Suicide Silence the possibility that they made the self-titled record when they were kind of out of ideas for just doing Suicide Silence, right? And then by doing that, and even if there hadn't been the extreme backlash and so on, that they might not have, just after a couple of years away from it, like that's fucking Paradise Lost. Look at Paradise Lost, right? They made that Host record that we spoke about recently as being the precursor to the new Host record that's come out. They make Death Doom now. That's where they started out. But they've been all over these different places, and bands rediscover the love for the old things they did by going and doing other things. And I think I think it's fair to grant Suicide Silence that possibility. Does this make this as good as their earlier records when they were, the most in that? Not necessarily, but just going back to what I was saying, with the amount of newer metal records we get and stuff, we were just talking about the Periphery record and the Pro Tooling and so on, just listening to the drums on this record, it sounds like a real drum kit. That's him there. You can listen to this performance and you can envision that guy fucking swinging his arms around the kit as he does it. And it's done with Taylor Young, formerly of Nails and so on, who does all the hardcore bands. And I think that over a, modern blowing your speaker apart sound, it sounds grimmer. Do you see what I mean about this? This feels so much more splattery than new deathcore. I feel like Enterprise Earth could not convincingly write a song about the Evil Dead like this feasibly could be. And there's just something really nice about that.
A lot of the modern deathcore feels very clinical and very, quite brutal. And even, bands who came up from Suicide Silence era, they're kind of all off trying to chase that as well. What are Chelsea Grin up to at the moment? They're not writing anything that's nearly as, like I say, blood splattered and grim as this. And that's what I think is, the guitars sound nasty. And, when you get the dun-dun, those, scraping riffs that they do, that, again, so unmistakably Suicide Silence. I was kind of I kind of miss that. It was this album felt weirdly comforting in a way, in that it just sounded like a grotty 2008 deathcore record. But again, because it's just so not interested in the current trends of deathcore, does, to me, make it feel more genuine.
Yeah, I completely agree. The way this record sounds is great. It's funny whenever you listen to something like, even stuff I like Lorna Shore, and I've seen people going I can't believe how fast that drummer is. And you go, well, I can't, but I'm not even sure it's real. It's that sort of level of speed and that clickiness where you go, the lines are blurred between studio trickery and someone behind a kit. This absolutely does sound like a band absolutely slamming it. And you mentioned Suffocation. I've sort of wondered maybe they're in the sort of Gallery of Suicide, gore-obsessed era of their career, where it's like nastier, sort of more thrashy records in a sense, which might not have the sort of star power, if you want to call it that, of something like Tomb of the Mutilated, or maybe where they'll go in the future. But there is a sort of comforting filth to the whole thing.
Like, I think this is one of those cases where I think Suicide Silence, despite, again, being once a band who talked a big game in terms of being progressive and so on, I think they are now offering a thing that, because the world has moved on and doesn't really offer anymore, they kind of feel refreshing for having gone back to what they were. And is it one of their weaker records? Absolutely. This is not as blood-curdling as The Cleansing or No Time to Bleed. It's not as massive and rallying as The Black Crown or You Can't Stop Me. But the riffing on this, when they have those Cannibal Corpse riffs in Dying Life, the suffocation kind of grinding intent that you get in Endless Dark, when the way it blasts out of the gate and then morphs into that kind of bone-snapping swing. Fucked for Life has this pace burst in the verses that feels like it's just tearing through meat. It's so visceral.
It's almost got that kind of like buzzsawy riff that you kind of get on it as well on Fucked for Life.
Yeah,
like bloody and nasty.
Like, Capable of Violence, No Fucking Way, I think is really good. Like, it's probably the biggest chant along bit on the record.
The What's Done Is Done, a Loaded Gun. Like, yeah.
Yeah, well, there is no fucking way. It's big. And in terms of like deathcoreisms, you know, the track title run of You Must Die into Capable of Violence into Fucked for Life into Kill Forever is hilarious, right? Like, you can look at that and go, wow, you are trading fully on deathcoreisms. You know, it's fucking hell. It's just fully set to kill mode in that regard. But when they do it, it doesn't sound just kind of old and gimmicky either. Like the big Brie guttural that opens up the end of Kill Forever. Like, when Eddie does that, it sounds genuinely kind of monstrous and intimidating. There are slight nods to other eerie passages, you know, bits of God Be Damned or Full Void. Alter Herself particularly is like a great track to kind of slow ever so slightly down and lurch into something a bit more ominous. That is as far as you're really getting this time, but it is blood-soaked and kind of scary.
You mentioned Eddie's vocals. I was going to ask, what do you both think of Eddie on this record?
I mean, I think he's not pushing himself in the way he can do, but there are sort of moments where he hits a scream and you go like, oh, he can still hang with the, you know, the cool kids of deathcore right now. He's still, there's a reason why he was one of the real kind of stand-up vocalists of the original run of deathcore bands, even though he's not like pushing himself.
I think this is Eddie in comfort zone, and I think he just sounds good doing that, if not being like, this doesn't have my favourite Eddie Hamida moments on record, but he's obviously just very good at what he does.
Yeah, I think, for me, just to separate it to look at this record in isolation, or at least kind of in isolation, I think Eddie being in comfort zone is fine, because he is one of the best in this game at the thing he does. But I was also thinking, he always had an amazing knack for hooks, both in All Shall Perish and in Suicide. So, like, to take something from a Suicide Silence record, Cease to Exist, all the parts are so catchy. And listening to this, he's by no means bad. Like, he's still got all the right tones, he can hit the highs and lows and everything. But it felt, maybe for even the first time, because I didn't even necessarily feel this one Become the Hunter, which I think is actually a lesser record than this, but maybe for the first time, it kind of could be anyone.
I think the drawback is supreme catchiness, and I think the one thing that I would say is a shame is that in their reverting to what was before, the massive crossover bangers seem to have dried up, which, even if you were just to revert to what you did before, The Black Crown, You Can't Stop Me, even No Time to Bleed with something like Disengage, they have that like big main stage festival, you know, those are the songs that help make Suicide Silence so big for a deathcore band. And the thing is, all of the new school bands I don't know if they've really managed to do those either. You know, like which bands of the current crop, they might be doing, like, you know, Lorna Shore doing something totally fucking different that Suicide Silence certainly never came close to, but are they writing Inherit the Crown? I don't know if they are. And, you know, the songs on these last two Suicide Silence records, you're not going to remember those as much. I think that's absolutely true, and that's what ultimately stops them being really great records. But I think, like, I'm beginning to view these records the way I do, like, aborted records or something. Like, the hits aren't really here, but they play fucking vicious.
Maybe the band that they have the most comparable arc to would be someone like Entombed, where it's like 4 records, 4 records of like pretty undeniable rumbly death metal, a completely wild veer which a lot of the fans hate, and then a sort of return to form that's not quite as good. We're sort of in that stage.
Yeah,
of
maybe we're in the kind of uprising Morning Star period of Suicide Silence, and I'm fine with that.
That's it. Those records aren't even. They're not bad. So you just.
No.
I'm happy to take this. It's just. I don't know. There's a part of me that goes, you can't forget what you know, and I don't know. So I do enjoy this while it's on, but maybe I just have to reset my expectations.
I think that is it. Is because like if you compare it to where they have been, it is a bit of a letdown. But I just. Well, because I went in with low expectations on this, and kind of just expecting a bunch of kind of also ran deathcore songs at this point that weren't going to excite me. But I was just like, no, this is nasty, it's violent, and I just kind of went along with it and was surprised at how much I got out of it in the end.
Yeah, the weird thing is because the genre has changed, they are now, by going to the past, offering something that no one else does. Yeah. Even their peers have done new things, because like Whitechapel, who I used to hold as one of the more like legitimately extreme metal kind of deathcore bands at the time, now they're closer to Tool sometimes, and you know that's great, but they have lost the gore. And this record is regressive, but Suicide Silence kind of offers something that the deathcore scene has stopped doing, which, you know, what new deathcore band is as suited to bonesaw amputation with no anesthetic as this record is? You know, deathcore used to be this kind of fucking Jack the Ripper core thing, and it stopped being that to become more processed in a way and more of the moment. So this is the sound of a band who have lost their ambition, but not the savagery. And they've moved from being a defining band at the moment to just kind of an extreme band. And the only thing they want to do is write music that sounds like murder. So the records aren't essential, but I do like that. And again, in a bunch of some of the records that we've had this particular month, it was nice to have something that just served you a sandwich and fucking, you know, didn't mix it up in any horrible kind of way. It's just good. So that's Remember You Must Die by Suicide Silence.